Hi, if you're watching this video today, then you're probably looking at valuation allowance release. And kudos to you for that, because you're probably currently profitable, or you're anticipating profitability in the near future, or you're looking at tax planning strategies which will result in taxable income to absorb your deferred tax assets. So hence the need for release of a valuation allowance. At Clifton Douglas, we've assisted a variety of companies in releasing valuation allowance when it's been appropriate, and certainly we've picked up some tools along the way. Valuation allowance release is a huge undertaking. There is just a tremendous amount of information in terms of, again, the rules associated with valuation allowance release and the weighing of the positive and the negative evidence that really makes it, like I said, a huge undertaking that involves company management, the audit firm, and then of course the tax service providers. So certainly can assist companies with that, but there are really three areas where Clifton Douglas has found, from a practical perspective, a lot of companies kind of jump into valuation allowance release when in reality, in these considerations, again, from a practical perspective, are really important to think about first before you endeavor in really evaluating all the positive and negative evidence and doing all of the, jumping through all the hoops that you need to in order to release valuation allowance. And so one of those practical considerations is that if you're in a situation in which case you have cumulative losses in recent years, and many companies that we deal with, this is their particular situation, in which case as a relatively new company, they consistently were generating losses, and then they start becoming profitable. Well, in that first year of profitability, all of a sudden they start thinking about valuation allowance release. But they've got these cumulative losses in recent years that really is such a severe level of negative evidence that it is really difficult to overcome in terms of positive evidence. So if you're in that situation, if you have cumulative losses in recent years, really your first step is to work with your audit firm, work with your tax service provider to see if realistically the valuation allowance review really needs to happen now, or should it happen the following year, in which case you're not quite in the same scenario. Once those cumulative losses in recent years, once that negative evidence has passed you by, then certainly it might be a better time to evaluate valuation allowance release. So again, if you have significant negative evidence like that, probably want to halt the valuation allowance release review and go over with your audit team as well as your tax service provider whether or not this is the appropriate time to really make that consideration, or maybe it should be left to one of the following years when you don't have so much negative evidence or that severe of negative evidence. So that's really the first piece of advice. The second one is really understanding from the beginning what the financial statement impacts will be upon releasing that valuation allowance. Because typically when a company releases valuation allowance, they're going to have a hit to their financial statements in terms of this big tax benefit that shows up kind of out of nowhere. There's this anomaly that shows up in terms of this large tax benefit, especially if you release valuation allowance in full as opposed to a partial release of valuation allowance. And in fact, you may want to request that you do a partial release of valuation allowance so that you can essentially smooth over that financial statement impact from that release, instead of seeing this full release, in which case you have this huge tax benefit that shows up on your financial statements. I will say though that our audit firms typically have policies in terms of how they prefer to release valuation allowance. Some really prefer and in times require a full valuation allowance release. Others a partial valuation allowance release. So really need to discuss with your audit firm, how they plan on going forward with company management in terms of, the applicable valuation allowance release. Also, it's really important to understand the positive evidence that you are using in order to bolster your case for a valuation allowance release, because again, economies change all the time. They're fluctuating all the time. So if your positive evidence relies considerably on, again, future profits that may in fact change depending on if the economy is still good or if it's fluctuating considerably, then the reality is that your deferred tax assets may not be absorbed. And in that particular instance, there may be kind of a worst case scenario in which case the valuation allowance is reinstated against your deferred tax assets because you can't absorb them or you weren't able to absorb them. So when you evaluate this positive evidence, kind of look at it from the standpoint of, am I going to be able to absorb my deferred tax assets in a relatively short period of time so that you can kind of avert any of those economic fluctuations that may come further down the line. Again, you want to avoid any possibility that in fact this valuation allowance will be reinstated against your DTA, because once again that's going to result in another hit to your financial statements, and this time a tax expense because you're reinstating valuation allowance. So you're going to have this huge anomaly that comes through in your financial statements in terms of a tax expense, and it's again, that volatility is never good. You want to kind of smooth things out. So again, really understanding valuation allowance release from a practical perspective before you endeavor in doing all of the work associated with an actual valuation allowance release will take you far. So Clifton Douglas, as I said, Clifton Douglas has worked with a multitude of companies with respect to releasing valuation allowance. We know all the rules surrounding positive, negative evidence, all the related accounting that goes along with that, and certainly are happy to assist companies where necessary in releasing valuation allowance. If you'd like more information on the assistance we can provide, you can give us a call or you can visit us at cliftondouglas.com. Thank you so much for watching today, and take care.